While millions remembered his father as the gentle giant of Bonanza, the son who grew up in that shadow carried a very different story. Dan Blocker died suddenly at just 43, leaving behind 4 children and a legacy that followed his family everywhere. Now, at 67, Dirk Blocker is finally speaking out. What he reveals about fame, loss, and the childhood he never really had is leaving fans stunned and completely rethinking the man they thought they knew behind Hoss Cartwright's smile. Dan Blocker was born on December 10, 1928, in DeKalb, Texas, and from the very beginning he stood out. Weighing an astonishing 14 pounds, he set a local record that people talked about for decades. Even his birth certificate got it wrong, listing him as Bobby Dawn instead of Bobby Dan Davis Blocker. His parents, Mary and Shaq Blocker, couldn't have imagined that this oversized baby would one day become a towering presence on American television. When Dan was 6, the family moved to the small farming town of O'Donnell, Texas, still grieving the loss of his older sister Virginia, who had died of pneumonia the year before. Shaq opened a grocery store and the family lived behind it. Dan grew up working, bagging groceries, hauling feed, and helping wherever he could. His size made him unforgettable, but it was his work ethic that earned respect in a town where everyone knew everyone. He grew at a staggering pace. By 12, Dan was already 6 feet tall and weighed around 200 pounds, often working alongside grown men on heavy labor jobs. Stories of his strength spread quickly, including legends of boxing older boys and even lifting a car off a trapped man. By high school, he stood 6 feet 4 inches, weighed 275 pounds, and seemed destined for a life built on physical power. His parents sent him to the Texas Military Institute at 12, hoping discipline would shape his future. After graduating, he played football at Hardin-Simmons University, where his size made him a natural. But everything changed after he transferred to Sul Ross State University in 1947. Helping backstage on a production of Arsenic and Old Lace, simply carrying props, sparked an unexpected passion. Dan switched his major from physical education to drama, discovering a love for performance that surprised everyone, including himself. At Sul Ross, he balanced football, theater, and odd jobs to get by. Despite offers from professional football teams and boxing promoters, he turned them down. Dan didn't want to be defined by his strength alone. He wanted to act. He graduated in 1950 with a degree in speech and drama and headed to Boston for summer stock theater, chasing a dream with no guarantees. That dream was interrupted later that year when he was drafted into the U.S. Army as the Korean War intensified. After basic training, he was sent overseas, eventually joining frontline combat in Korea. Among his fellow soldiers, Dan Blocker quickly earned a fitting nickname, the Big Un. Combat came quickly for Dan Blocker. His unit was sent into the frozen trenches along the Jamestown line, where snow, mud, and gunfire defined everyday life. He arrived as a private, but his natural leadership stood out almost immediately. Promotions followed fast, first corporal, then sergeant, and eventually master sergeant. In just over 200 days of active combat, Blocker proved he wasn't just taking orders, he was leading men under fire. Some moments stayed with him forever. On Christmas Eve 1951, his squad was pinned down on Hill 255 for 10 brutal hours in the dark and freezing cold. Months later, during a bloody fight on Hill 200, his unit suffered heavy losses while inflicting devastating damage on the enemy. In one fierce battle, Blocker was wounded while trying to rescue fellow soldiers. He earned a Purple Heart, but the experience left deep scars. After the war, he became openly critical of combat, especially the Vietnam War, saying he could never support bombing civilians after what he had witnessed. Despite the trauma, the war revealed his strength under pressure. He helped lead dangerous patrols in places like Porkchop Hill and Old Baldy, often carrying wounded men to safety despite being an obvious target due to his size. When his unit rotated out in July 1952, Blocker left with multiple honors, including the Combat Infantryman Badge and the Korean Service Medal. His Army service ended on September 24, 1952. 2 days later, he married his longtime love, Dolphia Lee Parker, in a small ceremony in Carlsbad, New Mexico. That same week, he returned to Sul Ross State to finish his education, earning a master's degree in drama. Acting was still the dream, but practicality came first. Blocker took teaching jobs in Texas and New Mexico, where students remembered his booming voice filling the halls during Shakespeare readings. He kept acting close, turning classrooms into stages whenever he could. Then, during a family vacation to Hollywood, everything changed. While making a phone call on a sidewalk, dressed head to toe like a cowboy, Blocker caught the eye of a talent agent. At 6 feet 4 inches with a rugged presence, he looked made for television. No audition was needed. In an industry hungry for Western stars, that chance encounter became the doorway to a life no one in his family had seen coming. Dan Blocker didn't move to California chasing fame. In 1956, he went to Los Angeles to pursue a PhD in education at UCLA. Academics came first. While studying, he worked as a substitute teacher in Glendale to support his growing family. By then, he and his wife were raising 4 children, twin daughters Deborah Lee and Dana Lynn, followed by sons David and Dirk. Life was demanding, but Blocker kept it steady, balancing school, work, and fatherhood. Acting started quietly on the side. His first on-screen roles were small and often uncredited. In 1956, he appeared as a bartender in The Sheriff of Cochise, followed by bit parts in Gunsmoke, Have Gun, Will Travel, Colt 45, Cheyenne, and The Rifleman. He even played a goofy alien called the Goon in a Three Stooges short, Outer Space Jitters, credited simply as Don Blocker. None of it was glamorous, but people noticed the massive man with the deep voice. The turning point came with Maverick. Blocker's role as Hognose Hughes showed something new. He wasn't just imposing, he was funny. Casting directors suddenly saw that he could blend strength with charm. That balance caught the attention of producer David Dortort, who later cast him in Cimarron City and remembered him when developing a new Western about a ranching family. When Bonanza entered production in 1959, one role was never in question. Hoss Cartwright was written specifically for Dan Blocker. No auditions were held. At first, Hoss was meant to be simple comic relief, the big, slow brother. But Blocker transformed him. Drawing on his intelligence and warmth, he played Hoss as gentle, thoughtful, and deeply human. The writers adjusted the character to fit the man, and Hoss became the heart of the show. Bonanza started slowly, but as audiences connected with Blocker's performance, ratings climbed. By the 3rd season, Bonanza had climbed to number 2 in the ratings, and audiences had fully embraced Hoss Cartwright. He wasn't just the strong one, he was the conscience of the family, the character who reminded viewers what the Cartwrights stood for. Behind the scenes, however, the workload was punishing. The show produced more than 30 episodes a year, with 5-day work weeks that often stretched to 14 hours a day. Dan Blocker was on set from early morning until late at night, enduring heat, heavy costumes, riding, and stunts. At times, the strain was so intense that he passed out from exhaustion, yet he rarely slowed down. By 1972, he had appeared in 415 episodes, an almost unimaginable pace by today's standards. What made the sacrifice harder was what Blocker left behind. Before acting, his true ambition was education. He had earned a master's degree, taught English and drama, and moved to California to pursue a PhD at UCLA. Acting came by chance, not design, and even after landing Bonanza, he tried to juggle filming with his studies. Eventually, the demands of the show took over completely. By 1961, he had to abandon his academic plans, a decision he later called his greatest regret. Still, Blocker's impact was undeniable. Hoss became the emotional heart of Bonanza, a character defined by kindness, integrity, and quiet strength. At its peak in the mid-1960s, the series wasn't just a hit, it was a cultural phenomenon. From 1964 to 1967, it was the most watched show in America, drawing nearly 19 million households every Sunday night. For 9 consecutive years, it remained in the top 5, reaching audiences in almost 50 countries. What began as a slow-starting Western became one of the most enduring television successes of its era. And much of that success rested on the heart Dan Blocker brought to Hoss Cartwright. Blocker wasn't just playing a rancher on television, he leaned into that image in real life. In 1963, as Bonanza was reaching its peak, he opened a steakhouse called Bonanza Sirloin Pit. The first location opened in Westport, Connecticut, inside a former Greyhound bus station. The name carried instant trust, and the idea took off. Within a few years, the brand was sold and rapidly expanded nationwide, eventually reaching hundreds of locations. Though most have since closed, Blocker had successfully turned television fame into a tangible business people could walk into and experience. His film career moved forward as well. In 1963, he appeared alongside Frank Sinatra in the Neil Simon comedy Come Blow Your Horn, a major box office success. The two reunited in 1968 for Lady in Cement, where Blocker played a menacing businessman in a darker, crime-driven role that showed a different side of his screen presence. Away from the cameras, Blocker lived a grounded life. During Bonanza's peak years, his children trained in karate with a then-unknown Chuck Norris, alongside Michael Landon's kids. The cast families spent time together, blurring the line between work and home. Blocker had married Dolia Parker in 1952, and they remained together until his death. Their son, David, later became an Emmy-winning producer, and Dirk followed his father into acting. Those who knew Blocker best remembered him not as a star, but as someone easygoing and loyal, the kind of man you could simply sit down and have a beer with. Dan Blocker was known to the public as television's gentle giant, the warm, steady presence behind Hoss Cartwright on Bonanza. But away from the cameras, he was quietly struggling. Standing 6 feet 4 inches and weighing close to 300 pounds, his size gave him an unforgettable screen presence, yet it also placed constant strain on his health. In the months leading up to his death, Blocker had been dealing with gallbladder problems, though few around him realized how serious his condition had become. Today, gallbladder surgery is routine and relatively safe, even for larger patients. In 1972, however, medical techniques were far more limited. Doctors later suggested that had Blocker undergone the same operation just a decade later, he might have survived. Instead, his size increased the risks, and he kept his pain largely to himself. On screen, he remained calm and smiling. Off-screen, he was fighting a silent battle. Tragically, his death came just as a new chapter was opening. 2 months earlier, director Robert Altman had cast Blocker in a lead role in The Long Goodbye, a dark, complex character completely unlike Hoss. It was the role that could have reshaped his career and revealed a side audiences had never seen. After Blocker's death, the part went to Sterling Hayden, but Altman was deeply shaken. He even considered abandoning the film, ultimately choosing instead to honor Blocker with a tribute in the credits. A quiet acknowledgement of the loss. Dan Blocker died on May 13, 1972, following what was meant to be a routine gallbladder surgery. Complications set in quickly, and he suffered a pulmonary embolism, a blood clot in his lungs. Despite frantic efforts by doctors and nurses, his heart stopped at 4:10 a.m. He was just 43 years old, leaving behind a legacy far larger than the gentle giant the world thought it knew. His death sent shockwaves across the country. Fans were stunned as the news spread within hours, struggling to believe that the man behind Hoss Cartwright was gone. Dan Blocker left behind his wife, Dolia, and their 4 children. twin daughters Deborah and Dana, and sons David and Dirk, who suddenly found themselves facing both private grief and a public outpouring of emotion. His funeral was held just 3 days later, drawing thousands, family, co-stars, and fans who felt they had lost someone personal. Michael Landon's brief tribute captured the mood perfectly. He made us laugh. He made us better. Blocker was laid to rest in a small Texas cemetery, far from Hollywood, but firmly in the hearts of millions. At the time of his death, Bonanza was in its 13th season and still a major hit. But without Hoss, something essential was missing. Ratings fell sharply as viewers drifted away. Producer Richard Collins later said the audience mourned alongside the cast, and it showed. The premiere of season 14 drew curiosity, but within weeks viewership dropped nearly 40%. NBC blamed a scheduling change, yet the truth was clear. Fans didn't want Bonanza without Hoss. Even Lorne Greene admitted it was over. The network canceled the show in November, and the final episode aired on January 16, 1973, ending a 14-season run of 431 episodes. Today, Dan Blocker's legacy lives on in a quiet corner of O'Donnell, Texas. In the center of town stands a bronze bust unveiled on July 4, 1973, just over a year after his death. The plaque beneath it reads, "Thanks to film, Hoss Cartwright will live, but all too seldom does the world get to keep a Dan Blocker." The memorial sits near the site of his father's old general store, where Dan once worked as a boy. Across the street, the O'Donnell Heritage Museum preserves his story, while a large mural along Highway 87 greets visitors with his familiar face. His son, Dirk Blocker, was born in Los Angeles on July 31, 1957. He entered show business early, appearing in a car commercial with his father at just 7 years old. That childhood changed abruptly when Dan Blocker died in 1972, leaving Dirk fatherless at 14. Still, he kept moving forward. By 16, he had his first TV role on Marcus Welby, M.D., and at 19, he landed a regular part as First Lieutenant Jerry Bragg on Baa Black Sheep from 1976 to 1978. His career unfolded steadily rather than loudly. Dirk appeared in films like Poltergeist and Starman, and on classic series including MASH and The X-Files. He also appeared in 2 Bonanza reunion movies, not as Hoss's son, but as a reporter. His biggest success came much later. At 56, he joined Brooklyn Nine-Nine as Detective Hitchcock, appearing in 147 episodes between 2013 and 2021 and winning over a new generation of fans on his own terms. Now, in his mid-60s, Dirk has begun opening up about what it was really like growing up as Dan Blocker's son. His father's fame followed the family everywhere, drawing crowds and attention that made Dirk wary of the spotlight. He never chased stardom, choosing instead a quieter life as a character actor. Still, his father's presence never faded. Dirk has spoken about the strange ache of watching Dan on television while missing the man who read him bedtime stories. What stayed with him most were Dan Blocker's values: kindness, humility, and decency. To Dirk, that was his father's true legacy, and it shaped the man he became.